How's it going? That is bias lighting. It's LEDs on the back of your TV that match the colors that you see on the screen. It's supposed to make looking at a screen in a dark room easier on your eyes. I don't know about that, but I know it looks dang cool. Do you want it? Yeah, you do. Let me show you how to get it. If you want, you can pay Philips a whole bunch of money, at least $350, and get a mediocre experience. Or you can buy this thing, which looks promising, but I haven't tested it myself. Or you can go full-on DIY with Hyperion. Hyperion is a free open-source software that runs on a Raspberry Pi. To match the colors that are appearing on the screen, Hyperion needs to receive video input. That video input can come from an external source, like your Xbox or your Blu-ray player, or it can come from a camera pointing at a screen, like that Govee device, or it can come from software like Kodi or Plex that is running on the Raspberry Pi. There's even a pretty slick program for Windows that mirrors what you see on your PC monitor. Hyperion takes the video input and then outputs it to the LEDs on the back of the screen. You have multiple choices when it comes to the outputs as well. Hyperion can control LEDs that are connected directly to one of the GPIO pins on the Raspberry Pi. Or some LEDs can be plugged into the USB port on the Pi. It can even control LEDs that are connected to the same network as the Raspberry Pi, like wLED, Nanoleaf, or Philips Hue. Are you excited now? Are you thinking about how you could use Hyperion in your house? You should be. Let's get on with the setup. Fair warning, this is an intermediate level project. You may feel lost if you aren't at least a little bit familiar with installing Raspbian, finding IP addresses, and connecting using SSH. Here's what you're going to need. Hyperion runs on a Raspberry Pi, so you're going to need a Pi. It can run on any Pi, even a Pi 1. Pi 0 is a good choice. I'm using a Pi 3, which is also a good choice. Next, you'll need some LEDs. I'm using indoor, non-waterproof WS2812 strips with 30 LEDs per meter. If you get a 5-meter strip, you should have plenty of LEDs to go around any reasonable sized TV. If you have an unreasonable sized TV, get 2 strips. If all you want to do is mirror a Windows PC display, or if you use Kodi or Plex on your Raspberry Pi, you don't need anything else. But I expect most people will want to capture video input from some external HDMI source. For that, you need one of these. This awesome little HDMI capture device. It takes an HDMI input, gives you an HDMI output to run to your monitor or your TV, and also gives you the USB output that you can put directly into the Raspberry Pi. That's it. One little box, it's all done. I guess you're also going to need power supplies. The Raspberry Pi and the LEDs both use 5 volts. The Raspberry Pi usually wants a 2.5 amp power supply. When you're sizing the power supply for your LEDs, my rule of thumb is 0.02 amps per LED. The newest, easiest way to install the new Raspberry Pi OS, which used to be called Raspbian, is by downloading this imager. When you start it up, it lets you choose which operating system you want. In this case, we want Raspberry Pi OS Other, and we want the light version. Then we can choose our SD card. Hopefully you already have your micro SD card plugged into your computer. And then write. Easy peasy. If you don't see your new drive here named boot, take the card out and put it back in. There it goes. You're going to communicate to the Pi using SSH. So you need to make a blank file named SSH with no extension and put it in the boot folder. If you're going to use the Pi's Wi-Fi, you need to also add the wpa supplicant.conf file with your Wi-Fi network name and information in it, and put it in the boot folder as well. If you're using the Ethernet port on the Pi and not the Wi-Fi, you can skip the wpa supplicant file. If you're using a Pi ZeroW, you don't really have a choice. It doesn't have an Ethernet port. I've used these 2 files enough that I keep a copy of them on hand. So whenever I'm installing Raspbian on a new Pi, I can just drag them into the boot folder. Excellent. Now we can eject. On to the next step. Now put the SD card in the Raspberry Pi, plug in Ethernet, and plug in power. Now fire up your favorite SSH tool. If you don't have a favorite, try Bitvice. I like it. You can try to connect to your Pi using raspberry.local or find the IP address in your router. SSH into the Pi using user Pi and password raspberry. Now at the command line, run sudo apt-get update and sudo apt-get upgrade. When it's done, we're going to wget the latest version of Hyperion. I'll put a line in the video description that you can copy and paste here, but in the months or years to come, that link will probably need to be changed. And since I'm not going to update the video description, I'll show you how to make sure you got the right link. The command we're going to put in here is wget space, then go to the Hyperion project releases page. As of right now, the newest version is alpha.6. If you're using a Raspberry Pi 3, you need to get the ARM version 7. If you're using a Pi Zero, get the ARM version 6. We're going to right click and we're going to copy link address. Then go back to our command line and right click and it will pop in the correct link. And now you can just hit enter and it'll download that version of Hyperion. Now the next command, sudo dpkg -i, and then the name of the file that we downloaded. And then right click. There we go. Now it will unpackage that .deb file and install Hyperion. For configuration, visit your browser. It tells you where to go. Please reboot your Raspberry Pi. So let's reboot first. Sudo reboot. You will need to go back to your SSH client and log in again. If you're going to use the GPIO pins on the Pi, then you also need to run these two lines. If you don't do this, you won't be able to get any output from the GPIO pins to control the LEDs. When that's done, point your browser to the Pi IP address and port 8090. If all went well, you'll be looking at the Hyperion user interface. The first thing you got to do is go to the wrench and the settings level and change it to expert. I don't really know if that's necessary, but it feels good to at least pretend to be an expert. Now we're going to go to configuration and general. If you're new to Hyperion, I definitely recommend that you keep this show explanations box checked. In recent versions, they added a lot of explanations to help you navigate through this user interface. If you take that off, those will go away. Now scroll down here to the LED hardware instance management. This is where you can define the different outputs, or as they're called here, instances. It already comes with the first hardware instance, but it really isn't configured yet. I'm going to change the name to GPIO 18 because that's where we're going to connect the LEDs. Now, because a lot of you will also want to use LEDs that are controlled by wLED, I will create a second instance called wLED TV. There we go. So now I have two LED hardware instances or outputs. On this page, all you're going to do is create and activate the different instances. We'll go ahead and start that one. This one is started by default. This isn't where you configure them. This is just where you name them and activate them. Now we can go back up here to the menu on the left and go to LED hardware. Up here, you can select which of your LED outputs you're referring to in this setup page. So all the changes that I make here under LED controller are going to be applied to GPIO 18. If I switch this to wLED TV, then I get a whole new, fresh, default LED controller setup that I need to customize to match my wLED output. For right now, we'll start with GPIO 18. If you're using the kind of LEDs that I'm using, which are the WS2812s, then under controller type, you want to pick WS281X. Hardware LED count. This is how many LEDs you have. Once you've installed the LEDs on the back of your TV, you should know this. The RGB byte order or color order is usually either going to be RGB or GRB. If when you start up your LEDs, your greens look red and your reds look green, then come back here and change this. GPIO number, this is the pin we're going to connect to. Just leave that as it is. In fact, you can leave all this as it is. Save those settings. Now we're going to go to the LED layout page. This is where you lay out how many LEDs you have running across the top, the bottom, the left, and the right side. So you're going to have to go behind your TV and count them, and then make sure that the right number is in the right box. If I had 100 LEDs, I'd probably have 30 across the top, 30 across the bottom, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right, as an example. Down here, you can see the way that the LEDs need to be laid out on the back of the TV. And it will give you a maximum power consumption estimation. I think these tend to really overestimate how much power you'll actually use, but to be safe, go by this and get yourself a power supply that's something higher than whatever it says here. Make sure we save that. That's the GPIO 18 setup. Now let's set up the wLED. So we make sure that our wLED instance is active. Then we go to LED hardware and configure it. There might be more than one way to do this, but what has worked for me is to use UDP raw. We're going to use the same number of LEDs. The target IP address is the IP address of your wLED controller, and the port is 19446. Save those settings. And then we also need to set the layout, same as we did before. The top, bottom, one side, second side, and save it. That's how you output from Hyperion to a wLED controller. If you do it that way, you have a wLED controller on the back of your TV, which would be a tiny little D1 Mini or Node MCU, and you don't have any cables running from your Raspberry Pi to the LEDs on the back of the TV. It all happens wirelessly through wLED. That's pretty cool. The next tab over here on the left is capturing hardware. It gives you a nice warning here that this is an instance independent setting. That means that whatever settings you make on this page will apply to all of your instances, not just whichever one is active. Enable platform capture. Platform capture is something that's running on the Raspberry Pi. If you're not using something that's running on the Raspberry Pi as the source of your video, you can uncheck this box. If you're going to use a USB capture device, which we are, then make sure that that box is checked. These priority channel numbers tell Hyperion which of these capture devices to use if it's receiving input from both of them. The one with the lower priority number will be the one Hyperion uses as its input device. On the effects page, you can select what effect you want to show on the LEDs when they boot up. Define a background, which is shown when Hyperion is idle. So if nothing else is going on, and there's no other input coming into Hyperion, it will just run this background effect. This remote control tab is pretty important. Most importantly, you get to control your inputs and outputs over here. If things aren't working or acting screwy, go to remote control and make sure that all the right outputs and inputs are selected over here. There is a whole lot more that you can do with Hyperion. If you want to dive deeper and get some information from people who know a lot more about it than I do, go to hyperion-project.org. And you've got a whole forum here, and it even comes in multiple languages. There's one more input method that I want to show you, and that is screen capturing on a Windows PC. To do that, you grab this Setup Hyperion Screen Cap exe, and when you start it up, you'll get a screen like this. What this Hyperion screen capture software does is it broadcasts through your network the information that Hyperion needs about what's on your Windows screen, so that Hyperion can then output back to the LEDs that you have on the back of your computer monitor. This is the capture setting for my Hyperion that I'm using on this Windows PC right now. So you'll need to add a new capture setting. And then under host name, you put in the IP address of the Raspberry Pi that's running Hyperion. Leave the port the same, and you can leave the priority as well. That should be all you need to do. And then save and close. Once you have that screen capture program running, down here in your whatever menu you call this, you'll have a little icon for Hyperion screen capture. If it's not running, you need to start it like that. If you want to make any changes, you go back into setup, and that'll take you back to this menu. Now let me show you how to connect everything to the Raspberry Pi. This is our capture card. This is my input. Right now it's connected to a Roku. Now you take a micro USB and you plug that into one of the USB ports on the Pi. This thing doesn't take very much power, so you're fine to power it from the USB ports on the Pi. This is a cable that also comes with the capture card. One goes into the output on the capture card. The other side just goes into one of the USB ports on the Pi. And then the last connection is the HDMI cable that goes to your monitor or your TV. If you're using a wireless controller like wLED, then this is all you need. If you're going to connect your LEDs to the Raspberry Pi, know this first. You will not be able to power all your LEDs just by connecting the LED strips to these pins. The 5-volt power pins on the Raspberry Pi are not going to allow you to draw enough current to run the LEDs. Either they just won't work or you'll ruin your Raspberry Pi. So your LEDs need a separate and usually larger 5-volt power supply. But you can power the Raspberry Pi from the same power supply as the LEDs. Technically, you can use the 5-volt pins on the Raspberry Pi to provide power to the Pi, but by powering through the USB connector, you have some safety features like a voltage regulator and a fuse. If you power your Pi by using the 5-volt pins, you won't have the advantage of those protective components. It'll probably be fine, but if something does go wrong, you could ruin your Pi. So here's a solution that I recommend. Find yourself a junky micro USB cable, preferably one like this that says charging cable only. We're going to sacrifice this cable. When you cut it open, you should just find 2 wires, black and red. If you do find 4 wires, black and red are still most likely plus and minus, and the white and the green are the communication wires, and you don't need those, you can just cut them short. Now this is going to become the cable we use to power the Raspberry Pi. Your LEDs are probably going to have a connector like this on one side and this on the other. This is the input, this is the output. They typically give you 2 extra wires for power as well. This is where we're going to connect the power supply and the Raspberry Pi. When you're choosing a power supply, remember your Raspberry Pi is going to need about 2.5 amps. So if you have 100 LEDs, that's 2 amps at least. And some people would say you need 3 times that much, so maybe even 6 amps. When you get into that size range, you probably need a power supply like this. This particular one is 5 volts, 10 amps. One of the nice things about using these is that they come with this barrel connector. That makes it easy to connect to something like this. And then you can easily connect these wires that will power both the LEDs and the Raspberry Pi. So that's your power connection. 5-volt power supply, large enough to power the Raspberry Pi and however many LEDs you have. The USB cable that we sacrificed goes in there and powers the Raspberry Pi, and the other 2 go to the LEDs. If you're going to have the Raspberry Pi mounted on the back of the TV next to the LEDs, then all you're going to need is 1 wire, something like this, that'll connect to the green wire here, which is the data wire, and then you connect the other end to the Pi to GPIO 18, which is the 6th pin in. So you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this one is GPIO 18. So this is one method, and it should work. I guess we can test it. Okay, this is the part where it'll either work or it'll explode. There it goes. Just took a minute for it to boot. So it's working, and we're getting good colors on the LEDs. If, on the other hand, you want to put your Raspberry Pi and your power supply far away from your LEDs, you're going to want some wire like this that has 3 conductors. Some strips of LEDs will give you an extra connector like this, or, since you probably won't need it, you can cut it off the end of your LED strip. Splice those together using your best wire splicing skills, and then connect this end to your LEDs. On the other end of your long wires, splice a female jumper to the green wire, and that's going to go on GPIO 18. Same spot. Skip 5 pins, and that's GPIO 18. These other 2 will tie together with our improvised power supply cable for the Raspberry Pi and plug them into our barrel connector. Plug the Raspberry Pi back in, and now the Raspberry Pi and the power supply can go way over there. And we've got all this wire that we can run to the TV. And once Hyperion starts, we should see some color on our LEDs, and there we go. Beautiful. Now, I don't know exactly how long this is. It's several feet long. There will possibly, probably, eventually, come a point where if you make this wire really long, the signal that gets to your LEDs will be too weak to give them the information that they need. If that happens, you have two choices. One, put your Raspberry Pi closer and make this wire shorter. Or two, use a logic level shifter like this. I'm not sure I want to go through how to use this. Do you really want to see how to use this? Okay. I'll do it. Fine. How to wire up a logic level shifter. Here we go. The purpose of the logic level shifter is to boost the voltage of this data signal that's going to the LEDs. To hook it up, you're going to need a bunch of jumper wires. You're also going to need to solder it because when you first buy it, it will look like this. First, let's connect the grounds. On the Raspberry Pi, this pin is ground. On the level shifter, this pin is ground. Then we need 5 volts, which on the Raspberry Pi is right next to the ground, or that particular ground. There's a few places you can get it. And then we want 5 volts on the side that says HV, ground and high voltage. We're also going to want 3 volts on the Raspberry Pi. That pin right there in the corner is 3 volts. So we're going to put 3 volts to the low voltage pin, low voltage. We're going to need another ground, and there is another ground next to GPIO 18. So if we count from this end, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we know that is GPIO 18. This pin here is also ground. So basically, from this ground, skip 3 pins, and you've got another ground. Go back over to your level shifter, connect that to the other ground. Next, we're going to connect GPIO 18. It's right next to that ground. We're going to put that on the low voltage side over here where it says TX1. Then we take the wire that goes out to our LEDs and we put that on the high voltage side where it says TX0. So here's one more good look at how this is wired up. On the low voltage side, you've got 3 volts and ground and TX1. This purple wire is going to GPIO 18 on the Raspberry Pi. On the high voltage side, you've got 5 volts and ground from the Pi. And the pin exactly opposite of the GPIO 18 pin is the one that goes to the LEDs. Now, if that all worked and I didn't break anything, you should be able to turn the LEDs on, and beautiful. With one of these logic level shifters, you could put your Raspberry Pi on the other side of the room, and you should still get a good data signal to your LEDs. Hopefully you won't need that, but if you do, now you know how to wire it up. We start the count up here in this corner. The LEDs are going to go this way, and then down, and then this way, and back up that side. Make sure you pay attention to which way the arrow is pointing. The arrow points in the direction the data signal is moving. I'm doing this just to count the number of LEDs that I want across the top. 1. I counted 17. Now these can just be cut. Any regular old scissors will do. Nothing special. Okay, there's 10. Now we're going to go 17 across the bottom again. 60 LEDs per meter might be better, but these are what I had, so this is what I'm going to use. And then 10 up the other side. I'm going to solder them first, and then I'll stick them on there. Don't freak out. You're not going to have to solder anything. These little corner clips work really well. Practicing soldering anytime you get the chance is always going to be a good idea. I have certainly been guilty in the past of not testing my LEDs before I installed them, and I've generally regretted it. So give them a good test before you install them. They do sell these LED strips in black also, so if having white strips on a black monitor or TV is going to trigger you, even though you don't see them, go ahead and get the black ones. And now we are done. It is demo time. Well, that's it. DIY bias lighting with Hyperion. Pretty dang cool. This video turned out to be a lot longer than I expected, so thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. I hope it was worth it. That's all for now. As always, thanks for watching. Until next time, adios. If you need help or want to chat with me or others who also enjoy projects like this, you can find us on Facebook and Discord. If you like what I'm doing and you want to support me, you can use my special product links in the video description, or head over to Patreon, or just like and share my videos. That's easy. If you like this video and you want to see more like it, this box will take you to a playlist of some of my favorites. In addition to videos like this, I also do live streams every Sunday. This box will take you to a recording of the latest live stream. That's all for now. Adios.